Thank you, Malcolm. And it's a pleasure to be with you all, or if only in a virtual sense, but we're all used to that now, of course. And it's very gratifying to return to this subject after, I mean, it seems difficult to believe that it's been 5 years since my book on the practice came out. But it's very nice to come back to these buildings after a break and realize, in fact, how good they actually are. So so I've enjoyed preparing for this talk. Well, that's the front cover of the book that came out. That's what it looks like in the flesh. I mean, in this talk, I'm going to focus on their work in Camden for obvious reasons. You might be wondering, what have these four architects got to do with Camden? Indeed, they worked all over England and beyond, but there are some interesting connections. As we'll see, their first office was at Fitzroy Square, and two of them lived for a time in Hampstead. And they built a little within the present day borough too. So my focus this evening is on two projects within the boundaries of the present day borough: a terrace of 6 houses at South Hill Park and a comprehensive school at Tufnell Park. I'll end my talk with a short coda where I'll try to sketch out something of their social and professional networks in Camden. So, from left to right, Bill Howell, John Killick, John Partridge, and Stan Amis. And before I go on, that slide needs updating for the sad reason that Stan died last year, as Malcolm mentioned, and I was honoured to write his obituary in the Guardian. So here they are, one of the most creative and idiosyncratic architectural practices in post-war Britain. They were of that generation to come of age in the 1940s. Bill Howell, John Killick, and Stan Amis were all public school educated. They all served in the RAF, or the Royal Navy Fleet Air Arm, and on being demobilised, they went straight into architecture school. Bill Howell did his undergraduate course at the Cambridge School of Architecture at Scroop Terrace in the city, before completing his studies at the Architectural Association in Bedford Square, of course, where he met John Killick and Stan Amis. On graduating, they cut their teeth at the London County Council, the LCC, its architects department, where where Leslie Martin and his deputy and successor Robert Matthew were building up the largest architectural office in the world at that time. Now, there they encountered John Partridge, a Londoner of somewhat humbler social origins than the others. John studied architecture in evening classes at the Regent Street Polytechnic, also in Camden, while working at the LCC by day. Howell, Killick, Partridge, and Amis, whilst working at the LCC, were largely responsible for the planning and architectural design of the Alton West estate in Roehampton, in the London Borough of Wandsworth. Outside of their day jobs at the LCC, the quartet moonlighted on various private jobs, including a short terrace of houses for Howell, Amis, and others at South Hill Park, of which more anon. The four men spent the rest of their professional lives together, setting up a partnership in 1959. They launched into private practice with a bold competition entry for Churchill College, Cambridge. And they went on to design student accommodation and educational facilities for the universities of Cambridge, Oxford, and elsewhere during that great expansion of higher education in the 1960s. But their output was varied, and it ranged from theatres to law courts, from prisons to chapel conversions. Their design approach was a problem-solving one, and their architecture can be somewhat didactic. It sometimes visually demonstrates how a particular solution was arrived at. Although they gained an early reputation as brutalists, their sensitivity to context, refined sense of light and materials, and their magpie eye for the qualities of historic buildings transcend any single style. Well, here they are again. Their way of working was so tight-knit and collaborative that it can be difficult to tease out the partners' respective contributions and design personalities. But at the risk of generalizing, we could say that Bill Howell and John Partridge were essentially the frontmen and the creative forces, if you like. John Killick is a somewhat enigmatic figure, a great intellect, a fanatical perfectionist with an intense focus on details. His contribution was sadly curtailed by the onset of multiple sclerosis, and he died relatively young in 1971 at the age of 47, I believe. Stan also directed his own projects and ran the business side of the practice. Bill Howell's untimely death in a car accident in 1974 changed everything, and the practice evolved significantly under John Partridge's leadership, surviving until the early 1990s. So let's go on to look at South Hill Park. It was through domestic architecture that Howell, Killick, Partridge and Amis made a name for themselves in the 1950s. Their designs for public housing, student residences and private houses represent different facets of a distinct attitude to home life, based on a new informality, a desire for personal privacy, and the inclusion of semi-public space to bring people together in an unforced way. Their housing layouts oscillated between two poles. The first was the Corbusian city in the park, if you like, seen here at the Roehampton estate, where a mix of tall and low housing forms are planted amongst green space. At the same time, and rather paradoxically, they had a parallel interest in traditional urban formats, such as the terrace and the infill house, which made up a dense and continuously built up urban grain, punctuated by squares and other set pieces. The density is broadly the same, but the figure-ground relationship between buildings and open space is very different. Now, the architect's recurring interest in squares and terraces can be traced back to the influence of their history tutor at the Architectural Association, John Summerson, and his 1946 study, Georgian London, which I'm sure many of you will be familiar with. John Killick's third-year thesis at the AA was entitled Two-Story Terraced Housing in London, 1774 to 1840. As they were daily reminded at Fitzroy Square, the Georgian terrace represented a model against which modern architecture could be held up. Howell argued, and here I quote, "Surely we should be able to devise systems of support, fire access, fire divisions, access, ductways, and exterior skin, which could offer something as good as a row house dreamed up 2.5 centuries ago." Unquote. Gap sites were plentiful in post-war London, and addressing urban conditions as found could make for an architecture of juxtaposition. This is House and Garden magazine from December 1953. And here they're publishing the Howell's rather provocative photo montage of a glass, timber and concrete house slammed into an early 19th century terrace. Now that drawing was derived from their design for 80 to 90 South Hill Park, a project which represents a pivot between the future partners' thinking on low-rise urban housing and a string of houses for friends and family with which they launched into private practice. This Hampstead terrace was designed in 1952-3 by Bill and his wife Jill Howell and Stan Amis for their growing families, along with 4 couples, mostly Cambridge acquaintances brought in to spread the financial load. So some background. South Hill Park, and this may be grandmothers and eggs, but I'll go on with it anyway. It was laid out in 1878 between the Lower Hampstead Ponds and Parliament Hill Fields, and our building is highlighted in pink. The land formerly belonged to Southend Farm, and it was owned by the Dean and Chapter of Westminster. At its upper end, as you can see from this aerial shot, the road forms a loop, a bit like the eye of a needle, originally enclosing a public garden, long since infilled. The best rooms in the new houses faced the road as opposed to the heath. The site of our terrace was formerly occupied by 4 large Victorian houses, which were destroyed in the Second World War by a German landmine. The process of redevelopment after the war was somewhat piecemeal. Stan Amis and Bill and Jill Howell initially bought 3 plots with the idea of building as many houses, but the high land values of £20,000 an acre made it necessary to squeeze in 5 houses into the space of what had been 3 plots. A little later, and here you can see those 5 houses in an early drawing of the scheme. Now, a little later, the 4th plot, which I've marked here in yellow, became available, and an additional planning application for a 6th dwelling was submitted in May 1953, and that was submitted to Hampstead Council. There was even sufficient room for an extra garage bay for one of the houses, which you can just make out on the far left in this photograph, later heightened and extended to the designs of Jill Howell in the 1960s. The neighbouring plot at 78 South Hill Park was acquired by their friend John Killick, and designs were prepared for a house of 4 stories and 3 bays of somewhat similar appearance and proportions to numbers 80 to 90. Now, on this long elevation, it's rather faint, but you can just about make out, the designs for the 6 terraces at 80 to 90. And then to the left, this townhouse of 4 stories, that's number 78. And that was designed, but in fact not in the event built. In the end, John Killick sold the freehold of number 78 to his former AA student, a man named Brian Housden, who realised his own idiosyncratic house on the plot in 1963 to 65. And indeed, that house was listed at grade 2 some years ago by Historic England. But let's go back to the development of the terrace. Building societies were extremely reluctant to approve loans for a narrow frontage terrace of modern appearance and unconventional layout. Eventually, some adventurous spirits offered loans, and the scheme was able to proceed. Faced with a low budget and the rationing of building materials, the architects resorted to easily available materials and techniques, namely unplastered 9-inch Fletton brick cross walls, floors of shuttered concrete, and rather chunky timber joinery. These raw ingredients, detailed from first principles, came to be a feature of HKPA's work. The frontages of the houses are only 12 feet 9 inches, and the building was made as long as possible as the LCC's regulations would permit. Instead of taking up valuable width, an open tread staircase runs across the middle of each dwelling, its concrete structure bracing the cross walls. Lit from a roof light above and framed by glass screens, the stairs split the deep plan into front and rear zones, allowing full-width rooms while preserving the dual aspect. So in other words, allowing light to penetrate the full length of the plan. From the model of the Georgian terrace was drawn the semi-independent basement, accessible from stairs at the front, which could be sublet, occupied by a friend or relative, or given over to a children's or teenagers' den. The design is closely related to their contemporaneous design for three-storey terraced houses at the Roehampton Lane estate at Alton West. The common source being Le Corbusier's Unité d'habitation at Marseille in the south of France, to which Amos and the Howells both made a pilgrimage. Le Corbusier, who was a big influence on all four architects, developed a dimensional system which he named the modulo. And this was a key influence at South Hill Park and other of their early designs. From the Unité was translated the 12 feet frontages, the 7 feet 6 inch ceiling heights, the galleried living room, and the balconies that you can see here in this slide. So we're looking here at the model, the Unité d'habitation at Marseille on the left, and a similar view in one of the South Hill Park houses, looking out to the ponds. And you can see that there's fully glazed elevation with access onto a balcony, and you can also see that there's a full height portion. So you've got that double height space, if you like, before you can just make out the edge of the ceiling of the upper floor there. So I won't tax you with too many drawings in this talk, but here are a couple showing the first floor plan of the terrace, and also a section, or if you like, cutting through the length of one of the houses. So you can see at the section at the bottom, so this idea of the staircase almost slicing through the plan and dividing the front and back rooms. And you can also see there the stairs at the front and a little winder staircase at the back leading down to the semi-autonomous basement. The sliding scale of Le Corbusier's modular proportional system encouraged design flexibility, and each house was customized with built-in variations. The Amoses at number 84 added a sitting room fireplace. You can just see the flue here. So we have 80, 82, 84, 86, 88, 90 from left to right. And the Amoses also added a sliding screen between their sons' bedrooms on the floor above. Well, the Wandmans at number 80 on the left here had a separate garage, which you can see here, and a basement kitchen diner in place of a garage. Each owner was consulted on the double height space I showed you on the slide earlier. Most of them opted for a 6 feet deep space, and a couple omitted it altogether. You can see the Wallmans here, and this number 86. They have continuous floor going across front to back at the first floor. The Howells, by contrast, opted for a more generous 7 feet 5 inch void. Here's their house, which brings it closer to the proportions of the unité, which are in fact 8 feet 10 inches, and you can see the slightly deeper space. The integral garages could also be converted to a workroom or study. Now, street level garages are a fairly familiar feature today, but very much less so in 1953. One precedent was the Amsterdam drive-in dwellings development of 1935 to 6 that you see on the left here. Whether they knew about it or not, we don't know, but I struggle to find sort of earlier examples of those garages in the UK. Now, the interiors have a mid-century, vaguely Scandinavian feel, with lots of white painted brick, knotty pine ceilings, and floors of quarry tile or wood block. The Amis and Howell houses were photographed for House and Garden magazine, and it's interesting to note their very different approaches to fittings and furniture. Readers could take their pick from Stan's impeccable contemporary styled interiors. This photograph at the bottom right, you can see their open fireplace, or by contrast, Bill's quirky Victoriana, with which he kitted out his house. The terrace at South Hill Park proved an influential model for public and private housing alike. One example is the influence on Neve Brown's terrace of 5 houses of 1965 to 6 at Winscombe Street at Dartmouth Park. These were built for the Pentad Housing Association, a small cooperative whose membership comprised the architect himself, Neve Brown, and 4 of his friends, plus their respective families. So a fairly similar development model, if you like, of subsidizing the architect's house with other neighboring houses for their friends. Neve Brown's terrace was, of course, a prototype for the celebrated public housing scheme that he and his colleagues went on to design for the London Borough of Camden under Sidney Cook. And of course, I'll refer here to Mark Swinnerton's recent book, Cook's Camden, with which you'll all be familiar. But Winscombe Street was in turn influenced by Howell and Ames's terrace at South Hill Park. And it's interesting to acknowledge here that Neve Brown was inspired to study architecture in the first place as a schoolboy at Marlborough College after a visit from Bill Howell, a Marlborough old boy. This would have been in around 1945, 1946. And when I interviewed Neve Brown, he told me he recalled the visit from Bill Howell with an enormous walrus moustache, and he was still wearing his RAF uniform, quite an imposing figure. And Bill suggested that Neve should go to the AA, where he was then studying, and to study architecture, which is exactly what he went on to do. Now, before going on to look at my second building, Ackland Burley School, I want to pause for a few moments on a small project that Howell and Killick undertook in the late 1950s at Fitzjohn's Avenue. Now, it's not a project that I was able to look into any great detail. It's a minor work, if you like. It's the kind of bread and butter job of the type that a fledgling architect would take on. But it's rather interesting for a number of reasons. Described as a do-it-yourself hotel, it was a conversion involving the gutting and remaking of a pair of semi-detached Victorian houses as a group of 36 bedsits with communal services. The developer was C.F. Killick Limited, a firm of property developers then run by Charles Killick, a property developer and art collector for whom the architects undertook a number of small conversion jobs at this time. The architects designed all of the furniture and fittings in a constructivist style of overlapping timber members, which were built up in the contractors' workshops. So you can see on the right-hand page a dressing table at the foot of a single bed. And also you can see at the right a wardrobe cum storage unit in the kitchen area, which is raised by 3 inches and fitted with patterned lino. The architects also remodeled the exterior of the building with double windows and tile hanging, which has since been reversed. Okay, so let's now move on to our other HKPA site, Ackland Burley School at Dartmouth Park. Again, some background on the history of the site. It formed part of an estate bequeathed to St John's College, Cambridge, by William Platt of Highgate in 1632. Now, here's how it looked in the 1870s on the first edition Ordnance Survey, and I've marked the outline of the 1960s school in blue. That site was purchased from St John's for £3,200 for the erection of a board school. Burley Road School opened in 1884. It's the one on the left in this early 20th century postcard. A mixed elementary school for 118 girls and 127 boys, it was designed under E.R. Robson, the architect to the School Board for London. An expanding population required several phases of expansion and reorganisation. In 1894, the building to the right was built for senior pupils, and in 1904, the senior boys moved to a new school in Fortress Road named Ackland School. The senior girls stayed until 1931, when they moved to a school on Chester's Road, later known as Brookfield School. Ackland and Burley schools were brought together onto Ackland Burley School in 1959, at which point the LCC decided to clear and redevelop the site. It was by then, of course, a comprehensive school, the Labour-dominated London County Council having pioneered non-selective secondary education under the 1944 Education Act. Its replacement looks rather different from the Victorian board schools. Ackland Burley School was one of HKPA's maiden commissions, and it came from their old employer, the LCC. Under Chief Architect Leslie Martin, seen here to the left, the LCC became a major architectural patron, employing newly established architectural practices as well as established firms. More specifically, the impetus came from their friend and ally, Michael Howell, who, as assistant housing architect, had championed their scheme at Roehampton and fended off interference from an unsympathetic housing architect. Powell, brother of Philip Howell of Powell and Moyer, later became the school's architect, and he got Howell, Killick and Partridge onto the LCC's list of approved architects. So a personal connection goes a long way. Instead of working with the LCC's education officers, as was the established convention, the architects were allowed direct contact with the head teacher, a gentleman by the name of Leonard Abley, who had strongly held views about how his new school should be organised. Here's the plan, the layout plan of the school. Now, three factors were foremost in HKPA's minds when they were planning the school. The first was a close fit with the organisation of the school and its curriculum at the time. Although that didn't necessarily mean that new ways of educational organisation should be precluded. The headmaster organised the school by age into 3 horizontal layers, so that there was a lower school covering the first 2 years, the middle school corresponding to the 3rd year, and the upper school for the 4th, 5th and 6th years. The architects responded by designing 3 teaching towers, and you can see them at the right for the lower, middle and upper schools. They each had year rooms in which small assemblies could be held and which doubled as dining rooms, served by dumb waiters from the kitchens below. Ably, decisively rejected the idea of houses, like them public schools have, as he put it, and which most London comprehensives had followed. The system chosen broke down a large school of 1,300 pupils into smaller, readily comprehensible chunks, which was of course less intimidating to newcomers. The second preoccupation was circulation. Design for HKPA was in large part about organisation, planning the flow of people and activities around a site. They often designed a building around the routes people would take around or through the building. At Ackland Burley, they aimed to minimise internal movement within the school, particularly when the bell rang for pupils to change classes or for lunch, which represented bottlenecks. The plan is compact and efficient, with the 3 teaching towers radiating out from the central concourse. And you can see that radiating plan here. The classrooms are grouped around staircases, not corridors. The staircase plan resembling the Oxbridge colleges, for which they loved and for which they were then designing. Their emphasis on circulation also shows in the covered walkways around the exterior of the site, with their framed views out, and the nicely detailed floorscapes with flints stuck into the gaps between widely spaced flags. The third requirement was that the pupils had to remain on site during the protracted construction period. Now I'm going to show you 3 maps here, before construction, during construction and after construction. So this one you can see here is the before construction map. So we can see the 2 board schools and some housing also on the site. Now this next plan I'm going to show you is during construction. And you can see the layout of the new buildings, which I've shown in blue, permitted the retention of the old board schools, which you can see here in pink, during the construction until such time that the new school was opened. Only then were they demolished to make way for the assembly hall, which formed a second phase. Now in this next map, a revision from the 1970s, you can see the final plan. So the old schools have been demolished and their place is taken up by the assembly hall. The history of the site is commemorated by plaques which they salvaged and reset in an outdoor amphitheatre on the school grounds, which survives today. additional space was also squeezed from the site by decking over the railway cutting from the north. And I've highlighted that in blue here. You can see the railway line. And so they reclaimed extra space in a rather ingenious fashion by bridging over the railway. And this provided extra play space, a car park, and a lightweight gymnasium made of timber and steel. And this was designed by John Partridge, and it had an innovative folded plate roof, but unfortunately it was burnt down in an arson attack in 1979. The railway deck, described by one American visitor as a way out solution, represented a major engineering feat, and as British Rail refused to close the 4 tracks for a single day, the engineering work had to be carried out at night over several months. Then, as now, the performing arts figured prominently in Ackland Burley's curriculum, and that emphasis is reflected in this jewel-like assembly hall, equipped with stages at both ends, a fly tower, and attached drama studios. It's almost a theatre with a school attached. This double-ended hall and the open-air amphitheatre was the first of a series of performing arts venues designed by Howell, Killick, Partridge and Amos, including some you may know, the Young Vic, Christ's Hospital Arts Centre, the Regent's Park Open Air Theatre, and the Albany Theatre in Deptford. Significantly, the architects showed their prospective theatre clients around this assembly hall. Well, let's look at the exteriors. Ackland Burley developed the precast concrete aesthetic of their early work for the London County Council. In many ways, the school is an unsung classic of 1960s brutalism, although you won't find it in many of the architectural guides and maps. The overall composition is taut and compact, dominated by a cluster of stubby towers and the prismatic hall. There is lots of concrete, inside and out, of different types and fulfilling different roles. The elevations are lively with incident, and each part competes to tell you what it does. Closely set octagonal columns, smooth and buff-coloured, alternate with crunchy salt and pepper slabs of exposed blue-grey flint. A strong horizontal emphasis is achieved with the jutting out no-shaped bands that you can see here. And these carry cables and pipes outside the line of the building. So rewiring could be achieved without disrupting the classes. You can also see here the projecting strips of acoustic windows that originally glazed front and back to lessen noise from the railway line. The sloping surfaces and dark aggregate were chosen to mitigate London's polluted atmosphere. This was only a few years after the introduction of the Clean Air Act. The interiors of painted concrete and brick partitions represented a deliberate move towards hard-wearing, tough finishes and an aesthetic to match. This was recognised by the school's architect, Michael Howell, who said, and I quote, "Hundreds of children all pouring into a school at about the same time present one hell of a problem of maintenance and therefore choice of materials. The early days of over-refined detailing, elegant curtain walling, sensitively chosen wallpapers are generally being superseded by buildings of a much more chunky character. Greater use is being made of fair-faced brickwork as an interior finish to classrooms and circulation areas. Fair-faced concrete, decorated, stands up very well to hard usage." Unquote. The prismatic plan and the chunky character of Stan Amos's detailing still dominates, despite alterations, and the school was listed at Grade 2 in 2016. Well, okay, I want to finish by exploring Howell, Killick, Partridge and Ames's personal and professional networks in Camden. Now, as I've said, their first office was on the first floor of 4 Fitzroy Square, the centrepiece of Robert Adams' East Range of 1792 to 4. It's this building, these 3 bays here, of course. Their landlord was the publisher Robert Maxwell, whose Pergamon Press occupied a ground floor office. Howell, Partridge and Ames took 3 offices overlooking the square with studios front and back. Partridge and Howell had adjacent cubicles, and after lunch they'd sometimes slide back a partition to work together, sometimes on the same drawing board. The practice library was run by Jill Lever, later curator of the Royal Institute of British Architects Drawings Collection. The HKPA office formed part of a long-established architectural enclave centred on the borough. One could trace it just by mapping out all the architect-designed houses in Camden. Obvious pull factors were the Architectural Association at Bedford Square, where all 4 of the HKPA principals studied or taught at one time, and the Regent Street Polytechnic, just south of Portland Place. And of course, not far away, you have the ROVA. Many of HKPA's contemporaries lived or worked in Camden. Just to take a few examples, there was Rayner Banham, the well-known architectural critic, at Opperton's Road off Primrose Hill. Next door to him lived Colin St. John Wilson, Sandy Wilson, of course the architect of the British Library. Their friend Alan Cahoon lived for a time at the Isacon Flats on Lawn Road, a famous gathering point for architects and other creatives since the 1930s. Of an older generation were, of course, the Goldfingers at Willow Road, who Bill and Jill Howell would occasionally pop in to visit. Their professional network took in other constructional disciplines, such as structural engineers. Hervé Arup and partners were at 13 Fitzroy Street, and their offshoot architectural practice, Arup Associates, were also based on Fitzroy Square. HKPA's favoured structural engineers were Harris and Sutherland, whose studio at Whitford Street nearby they designed. And here's some shots from their fit out of the interiors. When I asked Charles Howell, Bill and Jill's son, about his parents' social connections in Camden, the first thing he mentioned was Bill's long-lasting friendship with the artist Barbara Jones, who lived nearby in Well Walk. When Bill was a student at the University of Cambridge, he assisted Barbara on the fieldwork for her book, Follies and Grottos. In the early years of their practice, Barbara rendered a few perspectives. Here you can see again her impressive perspective for the Churchill College competition. I particularly like this student sitting on a red rug, and the vapor trail of a very newfangled jet aircraft, reminding them of the scientific and technological emphasis on that enterprise, Churchill College. A little bit later, in the mid-1960s, Barbara commissioned Bill to design a little studio in the back garden of her house on Well Walk. So you can see here on the left, that's Barbara's house on the corner, number 2. And in what was her back garden, she had this wedge-shaped studio designed. Later on, it was subdivided into 2 flats. It's a modest thing. There are no blue plaques here, but it stands in silent testament to a close artist-architect relationship. That's a lesser known HKPA job in Camden. And I'll close with this slide of the two of them, client and architect, at the opening of a book named Popular Arts of the First World War, which was published in 1972 and jointly authored by Barbara Jones and Bill Howell. And here they are at the launch of the book at the Imperial War Museum. So I think that's probably a good place for me to end a convivial Camden collaboration. So thank you very much.
Thank you. That was excellent. It's interesting what you were saying about the Camden network. I remember reading some figures once some years ago, which estimated something like 25 to 30% of the country's architects lived or worked in Camden, which was, you know, quite an impressive thing, and produced the sort of links that you said. I don't think I've been aware of such a varied range of products from any architectural practice, prisons to theatres, and everything like this. It was fascinating, and seemingly very much ahead of their time with building over the railways, something which people are talking of much more recently. And what a challenge that would have been with the railways. I can imagine that was difficult. But anyway, are there any questions? I can see some. Let's have a look. Unmute if you'd like to ask a question. I can't see anyone there at the moment. That's surprising. I think you probably covered so well the material.
Stunned them into silence.
I think it was quite fascinating to see inside Southfield Park, because that, you know, while it might have been covered by magazines in the past, I think they did it twice, but I've not seen inside them. So have you had the opportunity of going inside any of them in more recently?
Yes, fortunately. I mean, a few of them have changed hands in recent years, and we also assessed the terrace for listing about 5 years ago, and surprisingly, it hadn't been listed at that time. So I visited at that time, and we also had the interiors photographed, and I used the photographs in the presentation. They are amazing. I mean, they're incredibly compact, but I think the views out at both ends with those marvelous fully glazed elevations leading out onto the balcony really make the most and give a feeling of spaciousness. They're rather ingeniously planned.
Yeah, it just seems so surprising that, you know, when you were saying 12 foot 9 inches wide, yes, it's not very large at all. But yes.
I wonder, Malcolm, could I come in with
Yes.
a suggestion for somebody else in Camden who's associated with the Architectural Association? His name was Enrico de Piero. He was born about the same time as your practice people. He studied after the war and then taught at the Architectural Association. He went in for a competition to design the civic centre of Corby Newtown and won it. And all of a sudden he had to develop his own practice. So he left the AA, he ran his own practice, he built Corby Newtown. I think it's been rather messed about since. And he lived nearly all his life in a John Winter, another Camden architect, a John Winter house in a little road off Regent's Park Road called Regal Lane. and he died about 10 years ago. But he was a charming chap and very interesting, and had a lot of stories, as you've been telling us, about architecture and Camden.
Mm. Yes, I think certainly having the architectural, not only the practices, but the teaching institutions in the borough has made such a difference to the place. Yes.
And that, I mean, that connection between practice and teaching was a really fascinating aspect of researching these architects, because of course, especially early on when they were still getting going, they needed to subsidize practice, and they all of them taught at the AA, and the relation, the sort of generational relationships between themselves and their students are a really fascinating subject, and sometimes there was a two-way influence, I have to say, and they were of course rubbing shoulders with people like Jim Sterling and Neve Brown, who are also teaching either at the AA or the Poly.
My children went to Ackland Burley in the 70s and they loved it. It was a great school.
I should mention that the school, as some of you may know, is currently raising money for a project which is focused on that assembly hall, which I showed, which they're trying to refurbish into an community arts centre. And they have, they've indeed gained planning permission for their scheme. And so some of you might be interested in knowing more. They have holding a series of sort of evenings, inviting the local community in and explaining their plans. It's worth looking into.
Can the South Hill Park houses be seen across the pond, or are there trees obscuring them?
You can view them. They sort of form part of the backdrop to, is it the ponds number 1 and 2? And can never remember the numbers, but they are forming part of a backdrop. And I could have shown a photograph which shows that. But yes, you can make them out. I think that slide, I don't know if you can still see my slides. That opening slide of mine is the rear elevations looking out onto the heath.
Thank you. Let's go and have a look.
Well, are there any more talks? Speakers? No, well, thank you very much. There are 2 buildings that had fascinated me for a very long time, and to learn much more about how that was achieved and what they look like. And also, I hadn't been aware of some of their other developments, certainly in Camden. So that was a fascinating development. But thank you very much. And I'm sure everyone will show their appreciation.
Yes, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. A pleasure to be with you, and thanks for the invitation.
Thank you. Thank you.